A millionaire organizes a charity party and invites her gardener with the intention of humiliating him, but what he does during the party leaves her speechless. Veronica Hastings was the type of woman who made the air around her feel heavier, as if her presence carried an invisible weight. Tall, slim, always impeccably dressed in designer clothes that shimmered in any environment, she passed by others as if she floated above mundane concerns. Her serious face, devoid of any warmth, perfectly hid her cold and calculating intentions. For Veronica, everything and everyone were pieces in a grand game, and what gave her the most pleasure was displaying her power over others, always discreetly but effectively. The mansion where she lived was an extension of her personality, imposing, magnificent, but devoid of true joy. Situated at the highest point in the city, the house was a monument of glass and marble, with imposing columns that reflected the glow of the party lights about to happen. The perfectly trimmed garden, the artificial lake that looked like a mirror, and the exotic flowers, all arranged with surgical precision, showed the world what Veronica wanted them to see: perfection and control. The event that evening was announced as a charity party, but everyone knew that charity was just a front. Veronica's real intention was another: to reaffirm her place at the top of the social pyramid. Every detail of the party, from the golden invitations to the gleaming crystal, conveyed her desire to be admired and feared. Everything screamed power, from the French champagne served by the waiters to the superficial conversations echoing through halls adorned with million-dollar works of art. But at its core, the party wasn't just about flaunting wealth. There was a more personal play in mind. Veronica had invited a specific person with a cruel purpose. Ethan, her gardener, was included in the guest list. Not because she appreciated him, far from it. He would be there as a symbol, a stark contrast between simplicity and the opulent world she inhabited. He was the final piece of her plan, to humiliate him in front of the city's most select eyes, showcasing the abysmal distance between their worlds. While the other guests could hardly wait to be seen in that extravagant setting, Veronica had only one thing in mind: to see the discomfort on Ethan's face as he crossed those doors. She imagined the pitying looks, the disguised smiles of superiority. It would be the crowning moment of her night, the pinnacle of her dominance over everyone around her. "He will know his place," she murmured to herself, adjusting a diamond necklace that gleamed around her neck, looking at herself in the mirror like a queen on her throne. Veronica knew exactly what she was doing. Her actions were calculated, and every word she would say that night had a purpose: to crush any trace of dignity that Ethan might have brought with him. The party was coming to life, and Veronica's mansion was shining like never before. Luxurious cars paraded down the circular driveway, and the city's elite arrived, flaunting jewels, dresses, and smiles that were no more than masks. The waiters glided silently among the guests while soft music filled the air, creating an atmosphere that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. A fairy tale, however, where the fairy godmother was actually the villain. Veronica watched everything from afar with keen eyes. Every detail was under her control, just like the people around her. She could hardly contain her excitement to see her trap spring into action. After all, what could be more satisfying than seeing someone as insignificant as Ethan being crushed under the weight of a wealth he would never possess? The game was already in motion, and Veronica was ready to watch the spectacle. Ethan was a man of few words, but his silence carried a serenity that few understood. Of average height, with calloused hands from hard work and a face weathered by the sun, he didn't attract attention with his appearance. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet depth, the look of someone who understood the world on a level that couldn't be translated into words. For Ethan, life was simple, and simplicity was his greatest wealth. He never cared about the luxury surrounding him while tending to Veronica Hastings' vast garden. To him, there was more beauty in the flowers he planted than in the cold marble corridors of the mansion. His love for nature was visceral, almost spiritual. Every morning before the sun rose, Ethan was already in the garden, hands buried in the earth, smelling the fresh scent of wet grass. It was there, among the plants, that he found peace. Every new seed planted, every sprout that emerged, was for him a reminder that life always finds a way to bloom, even in the most adverse circumstances. And, in a way, Ethan saw himself reflected in this. His life hadn't been easy, but he too had found ways to grow and thrive quietly, without the need for applause or recognition. Despite working at one of the most luxurious properties in the city, Ethan had never been dazzled by money or power. He saw the extravagant guests passing through the mansion, always in a hurry, always carrying a kind of emptiness in their fake smiles. He realized, without needing words, that those people were always chasing something they could never reach. But not Ethan. He had already found what he was looking for. It wasn't a life full of possessions but a life full of purpose, where the natural rhythm of things dictated the course of his days. Ethan didn't have many friends, but all who knew him respected him deeply. He helped without hesitation, whether it was to fix a broken fence or just to patiently listen to others' problems. He believed that a person's value wasn't in what they possessed but in what they offered to the world. And what Ethan offered, although simple, was always genuine. To him, true wealth lay in the connections one could cultivate, with the earth, with others, and with oneself. Veronica had never truly looked him in the eye. To her, he was nothing more than another employee, part of the scenery of the mansion. But Ethan harbored no resentment. He understood that some people were so caught up in their illusion of grandeur that they couldn't see the beauty in simple things. And that didn't bother him. He knew that nature was patient. It didn't demand immediate recognition. Over time, roots grew, trees stood tall, and flowers bloomed. And so it was with people. Ethan believed that, with patience, everyone could flourish in their own way. There was something deeply meditative in his work. While pruning the roses or caring for the trees, Ethan found a greater meaning in life. Time passed slowly for him, and this made him notice details that most ignored. The movement of the clouds, the birdsong at dawn, the gentle wind passing through the leaves, all of this was part of his routine, and he felt grateful to be there, witnessing the natural cycle of things. Even surrounded by so much luxury, Ethan never felt out of place. He knew he didn't belong to that world of mansions and glamorous parties, but that didn't make him feel inferior. On the contrary, he had something that many there would never have, a soul at peace. While others chased after material wealth, Ethan had discovered an inner wealth that could not be bought. His connection with nature gave him a silent strength, a sense of belonging that no marble hall could offer. His world was made of earth, sun, and rain, and that was what he valued most. At the end of each day, he sat on a small wooden bench in the farthest corner of the garden and simply watched the sunset. Those moments, when the sky was tinged with orange and pink, were his favorite. There, in silence, Ethan felt a peace that needed nothing more. And it was that peace that kept him steady, even in an environment that often seemed the opposite of everything he believed in. And so, while Veronica planned her grand parties and social traps, Ethan lived his life simply but with purpose. He knew that, in the end, true greatness wasn't found in grand things but in small gestures, in silent kindness, and in the wisdom that comes from living in harmony with the world around you. And for Ethan, that was enough. Veronica Hastings' charity party wasn't just a simple benefit gathering, it was the event of the year, something that would have the whole city talking for weeks. For Veronica, every detail mattered. The lights had to reflect just the right brilliance on the guest jewels. The sound of silverware against fine porcelain should be soft, almost like an orchestrated melody. And of course, nothing ordinary. The wine would be a rare Chateau Margaux, a vintage of incalculable value, and the dishes, prepared by a Michelin-starred chef, promised to take the guests on an unforgettable sensory experience. Veronica meticulously went over the guest list, adjusting with precision who should sit next to whom, ensuring that power alliances were in perfect harmony. It was a game of social chess, where each piece was strategically positioned to highlight her superiority. The main hall would be decorated with exotic flowers imported from across the world, and the delicate aroma would mix with the sound of a live orchestra. But for Veronica, what really mattered wasn't the donations or the charity cause. It was her own image, shining as the center of a universe where all eyes would be on her. Each dish served that night would be a work of art. The starters, small sculptures of flavor, would be carefully assembled to impress even the most demanding palate. Beluga caviar, grilled lobster with herb butter, and a parade of desserts so delicate they seemed made of glass. Nothing would be left to chance. Veronica had a team dedicated solely to polishing the silverware, ensuring that every reflection was perfect, almost like a mirror for her vanity. Amidst all that luxury, she decided there would be a silent auction. Rare pieces, works of art, and jewels would be offered, and the bids would do more than raise money. They would demonstrate the power of those who could spend without hesitation. Veronica wanted to see who would dare to compete for the highest bids, who would emerge victorious in that financial battlefield that, for her, was more important than the cause itself. She knew that generosity wasn't the reason for the donations, but the need to show who had the most. But the centerpiece of the evening would be herself. Veronica had commissioned an exclusive dress from a European designer that, according to rumors, cost more than most people's annual salary. A long gown of blue silk, encrusted with crystals that reflected every beam of light, like stars in a night sky. The dress was designed so that, as she crossed the hall, everyone would have to stop and admire, a subtle and silent reminder of who ruled that environment. The party wasn't about charity, it was about power. and Veronica was power incarnate. The mansion staff were in a frantic rush. There was so much to organize that it felt like the party began long before the first guest arrived. Red carpets were rolled out, chandeliers were carefully inspected to shine with the necessary intensity, and Veronica oversaw everything with sharp eyes. No detail went unnoticed. She knew the party had to be flawless because her reputation was at stake. A single mistake, one detail out of place, and the murmurs of high society would turn against her. When the night of the party finally approached, Veronica mentally reviewed her plan with satisfaction. Everything was ready to be a memorable night, but not just for the reasons others imagined. She knew that, among the laughter and champagne glasses, there would be a moment of pure delight for her. The moment when her gardener, Ethan, crossed the mansion doors as a guest. Veronica visualized the surprise and discomfort in his eyes, a sense of inadequacy in the face of so much luxury. For her, that would be the climax of the night. Veronica wasn't just organizing a benefit event. She was preparing a social trap, a cruel demonstration of how power was not just about money but about humiliating those who didn't belong to her world. By inviting Ethan, she intended to put him in an impossible position. Surrounded by luxury and wealth he could never imagine, he would be exposed, naked, at the mercy of the elite's glances and concealed smiles. And so, while the finishing touches were being made and the important guests confirmed their attendance, Veronica smiled to herself, savoring in anticipation what was to come. After all, the party wasn't just about raising funds, but about reminding everyone, and especially Ethan, who really controlled the game. Veronica walked through the garden with an air of superiority that seemed to ripple in the air around her. Her heels sank slightly into the soft grass as she headed toward the gardener, Ethan, who, as usual, was crouched beside a flower bed, trimming the leaves with precision. The contrast between the two was almost symbolic. She, resplendent in an expensive dress, and he, with his hands dirty from the earth, wearing simple clothes that barely highlighted his presence. Veronica held a golden envelope in one of her hands, her malicious smile almost imperceptible. "Ethan," she called, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I've been thinking about you." He stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his apron. The humble and attentive look he directed at Veronica seemed oblivious to the trap she had set. "You work so hard around here. I think you deserve a little break," she continued, extending the invitation to him. "I'm organizing a charity party at the mansion, something you might never have experienced. I thought it would be interesting for you to attend." There was something cold and calculated in her speech. Veronica knew that the idea of a simple gardener in the midst of the rich and powerful elite was a joke waiting to happen. Ethan, however, took the invitation without hesitation, looking at the envelope with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. "Thank you, Mrs. Hastings," he replied, his voice calm and polite. Veronica remained silent for a brief moment, watching him, waiting for some sign of discomfort or embarrassment, but he maintained his composure, which irritated her slightly. "Oh, you don't need to worry about formal attire," Veronica added with an ironic smile. "I'm sure whatever you wear will be appropriate." Her words floated in the air like a sharp blade, but Ethan merely nodded with a slight smile, unaware of the venom behind those words. Veronica turned, her dress swirling in the wind, and began walking back toward the mansion, satisfied with the thought of how amusing it would be to see him out of his natural environment, surrounded by people who barely knew his name. As she walked away, Ethan looked at the invitation for a moment. He had never been invited to anything like this. The mansion, which he knew as his workplace, would be transformed into a place of luxury and excess, and he, the simple gardener, would be part of that party. The invitation in his hands was real, but so was the sense of being tested. Ethan knew his place that night would not be the same as the other guests, but that didn't worry him. He had never cared about appearances or the social games of those who lived in a world so distant from his. When he entered his home that night, Ethan looked again at the invitation. "Charity party?" he murmured to himself. He knew that true charity wasn't in grand parties and luxurious events, but in small gestures, in silent and selfless care. Still, he would prepare himself, not out of pride or vanity, but out of respect for the invitation he had received, despite his misgivings. Ethan saw no malice in the offer, though he felt something wasn't entirely right. While Veronica, in her mansion, reveled in the anticipation of the humiliation awaiting Ethan, he simply went on with his routine. He continued to tend the garden with the same dedication, as if the invitation hadn't shaken the tranquility he always carried with him. For Ethan, life followed its course, and though he didn't know exactly what awaited him at the party, he wouldn't let fear or discomfort take over. Veronica, on the other hand, was already imagining the spectacle. She planned every detail of the party, But what truly made her smile were the moments when she visualized Ethan, the humble gardener, trying to blend in with the elite. It will be ridiculous, she thought, her eyes gleaming with a cruel sparkle. The vision of Ethan out of place, lost in a sea of luxury, was one of the reasons she was so eager for that night. And so, the days passed, with Veronica eager for her big moment and Ethan preparing himself with the same simplicity as always. Both were heading toward the same night, but with completely opposite intentions. While she longed for humiliation, he prepared with the same generous heart that guided each of his days, unaware that at that party, something far greater than anyone could predict was about to happen. The night had finally arrived. Veronica Hastings' mansion gleamed like a jewel in the darkness, its lights reflecting off the luxury cars that arrived one after another. The gates were open, revealing the illuminated path leading to the main hall, where the guests in their gala attire paraded like peacocks, each seeking to be the center of attention. The sound of elegant conversations and crystal glasses clinking echoed through the vast garden, mingling with the soft music of the live orchestra. It was as if all the opulence of the city had been condensed there on that night. The air was thick with anticipation, and the staff scurried back and forth, ensuring that nothing got out of control. Veronica, splendid in her shimmering blue dress, was at the center of it all, receiving each guest with calculated smiles and carefully chosen words. She reigned supreme in that environment, like a queen in her castle, knowing that every detail reflected her perfection. But behind her impeccable smile was an anxiety only she knew, the wait for the moment when Ethan, the gardener, would cross those doors. And then, like an unexpected note in a perfectly orchestrated symphony, he arrived. Ethan walked slowly through the entrance of the mansion, wearing a simple suit that couldn't hide his modesty. There was no ostentation in his steps, nor any desire to be noticed. Unlike the other guests, he seemed almost out of place, like a figure who didn't belong in that painting of wealth. But there was something about him that drew attention, not because of his modest suit or serene expression, but because of the tranquility he carried with him. As he passed through the main door, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Some curious glances turned toward him, and discreet whispers began to spread among the groups. Ethan, however, appeared unaware. His attention was focused on the environment around him, the large silk curtains hanging from the ceiling, the crystal chandeliers that shone like stars, and the flower arrangements he himself had cared for, now transformed into centerpieces of the decoration. It was a surreal vision, being amidst so much luxury, surrounded by faces he only knew from afar, while remaining the same simple man as always. The tension in the air was palpable. Veronica, from a distance, spotted Ethan, and a slight smile curved her lips. She knew that this would be the highlight of the night. Watching the discreet glances of the other guests, she could feel the discomfort growing, and it gave her a strange satisfaction. She slowly approached him, her elegant footsteps echoing on the marble floor, eager to begin what she considered a silent spectacle of humiliation. Ethan, however, remained calm as if the entire setting didn't affect him. The guests continued to arrive, their bright clothes and sparkling jewels standing in stark contrast to Ethan's simplicity. Waiters passed by with trays of champagne and exquisite appetizers, but Ethan politely declined, preferring to observe from a distance. He wasn't uncomfortable, but there was a lightness in his gestures that seemed to unsettle those around him. While the others strived to stand out, he remained an island of serenity in a sea of vanity. The soft music from the orchestra filled the air, but there was a silent tension among the guests. The contrast between Ethan and the others was evident, and he seemed to stand out, not because of his appearance but because of the lack of any effort to fit into that world. The glances that had once ignored him now followed him with curiosity. It wasn't common to see someone like him there, and unsure of how to react, many contented themselves with observing from a distance, waiting for the unfolding of that unusual evening. Veronica finally reached him. "Ethan," she said, with a smile that barely concealed her malice, "I see you accepted my invitation. How wonderful that you could come." There was an exaggerated lightness in her voice, as if she were speaking to a child who had done something adorable. Ethan smiled back, unaware of the venom behind the words. "I'm glad for the invitation, Mrs. Hastings," he responded, with the same simplicity he always carried. "It's a beautiful evening." And so, while the party continued to pulse around them, Veronica and Ethan stood face to face, like two distinct worlds meeting. She, wrapped in her bubble of power and wealth, and he, with a calmness that seemed impenetrable. At that moment, the tension between the two intensified, but in a way that no one expected. What Veronica didn't realize was that, although Ethan was an unexpected guest in that universe of luxury, he was not a victim. and the night she had planned to humiliate him held surprises she could never have anticipated. As Ethan moved through the hall, it was impossible to ignore the looks of disdain that began to emerge. The elegant conversations among the social elite would pause for a moment whenever he passed, and then be replaced by discreet whispers. The people around him, draped in jewels and expensive dresses, cast quick glances, evaluating the gardener with a curiosity mixed with superiority. Some whispered to each other, with small malicious smiles on their lips, as if they were watching a strange and comical spectacle. Veronica, always attentive to the details, watched everything with a discreet smile, as someone who appreciates the unfolding of a carefully executed plan. She knew that Ethan didn't belong to that world and expected that the longer he spent among the guests, the more obvious it would become to everyone. There was something almost cruel in the way she, without rushing, allowed him to circulate through the party, waiting for the right moment to start her provocations. She liked to prolong the tension, to let the glances make him question his presence there. With every step Ethan took, the contrast between him and the other guests became more evident. While the men laughed loudly in their tailored suits and silk ties, and the women flaunted their long dresses shimmering with sparkles that captured the light from the chandeliers, Ethan remained serene. His simple suit seemed to clash with the extravagance around him, and although he was perfectly dressed, it was his aura of tranquility that drew the most attention. He walked slowly, not trying to impress or conform to the environment, as if he were simply accepting the space he had been given, without demanding anything more than that. A group of women, with champagne glasses in hand, observed from a distance, exchanging knowing glances. One of them, wearing a pearl necklace that gleamed under the lights, murmured something, causing the others to laugh discreetly. It was clear that Ethan was the target of their comments. However, he seemed oblivious to this, his attention focused on the works of art hanging on the walls and the flower arrangements, which, curiously, he himself had tended to. There was a peace in his eyes that seemed to contradict the superficial environment in which he found himself. Veronica couldn't help but feel a certain impatience. Ethan wasn't reacting as she expected. He showed no signs of embarrassment, discomfort, or insecurity. While the other guests observed him with judgmental looks, he remained calm, almost as if he were at peace with himself. This subtly irritated her. It was as if her attempt to expose him to ridicule was being sabotaged by the very calmness he exuded. And this only made Veronica more eager to test the limits of his patience. Interesting, isn't it? Veronica approached Ethan with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, interrupting his moment of observing a sculpture. Parties like this have their own atmosphere. Something you might never have experienced before. The insinuation was clear, but Ethan's response was just a gentle smile. Yes, it really is a beautiful night, he said, without noticing or perhaps not caring about the hidden malice in her words. The guests around them continued to observe, some chuckling quietly while sipping their expensive wines. Veronica, in her elegant posture, seemed to be in complete control of the situation. To her, this wasn't just a charity party, but a social arena where the real game was to measure power with glances and words. And at the center of it all, Ethan, with his disarming simplicity, became the perfect target for her desire to reaffirm her status and power. Every time Ethan interacted with the guests, the contrast between their worlds became more evident. He didn't talk about investments, trips abroad, or the latest fashion collections, topics that seemed to dominate the room. Instead, his responses were brief, polite, and centered on small observations about the beauty of the garden or the work he loved. This, for many there, seemed like a foreign language, something they neither understood nor wanted to understand. However, Veronica was just beginning. She knew she needed something sharper, more direct, to break Ethan's serenity. Her subtle provocations were just the beginning. With every step he took, with every new look he received, the atmosphere at the party seemed more charged. It was as if everyone was waiting for an outcome. A moment when the game would reveal itself fully, and Veronica's true intentions would come to light. And so, the party continued with two worlds colliding. On one side, the unbridled luxury and glamour. On the other, the simplicity and silent dignity of a man who, even out of his element, remained steadfast in who he was. And as the eyes continued to linger on him, Ethan, unknowingly, was setting the stage for a twist that no one, not even Veronica, could foresee. Veronica, with her sharp smile, didn't miss a single opportunity to jab at Ethan. As she strolled through the hall beside him, every word from her lips was carefully planned, disguised as courtesy but loaded with cruelty. It must be interesting for you to see the world from this side, Ethan. It must not be common to have so many important faces around you in your day-to-day work in the garden, she said, with a look that passed over the rich guests and returned to him, as if watching a child trying to play in a field of adults. Ethan, always polite, nodded with a slight smile. "Yes, it's different," he replied without the slightest hint of embarrassment. He seemed more interested in the details around him, in the flowers he had planted and that now decorated the hall. But Veronica wouldn't let the conversation die so easily. There was something in her that compelled her to continue. Perhaps it was the desire to break the uncomfortable calm that he exuded, as if nothing could affect him, even in an environment clearly designed to make him feel small. "I imagine these dishes are a novelty for you too," Veronica continued, picking up a glass of champagne and subtly raising it as waiters passed with trays of sophisticated canapés. "It's not every day you get to taste beluga caviar or drink wine that costs more than a month's wages, is it?" There was a cruel gleam in her eyes as she waited for Ethan's reaction, imagining that at any moment he would finally show some sign of discomfort. But to her frustration, Ethan remained unfazed. "That's true, I've never tried it," he responded, still with the same calm tone, while observing the movement around him. "But it's good to try new things from time to time." He wasn't defending himself, nor was he reacting aggressively. He was simply acknowledging the obvious without giving the provocation the weight that Veronica desired. This seemed to irritate her even more. However, Veronica wouldn't give up so easily. She approached a small group of guests, bringing Ethan along as if he were a trophy she intended to display. "Ladies," she said, smiling, "I would like to introduce you to Ethan, our gardener. He is enjoying a unique experience tonight." The women in the group chuckled softly, exchanging condescending glances. "How charming," said one of them, trying to hide the amusement in her voice. "It's always good to have new experiences." "What did you think of the decor, Ethan?" Veronica asked with a sharp look. "After all, you were the one who took care of all these flowers. I imagine it must be a bit different seeing them like this, used for something so grand." Her intention was clear, to remind Ethan of his place, that he was there not as an equal, but as part of the machinery that supported that spectacle of luxury. The flowers adorning the hall, so admired by the guests, were his work, but he wasn't part of the world that celebrated them. Ethan, however, seemed immune to the provocation. "They look beautiful," he said, looking at the arrangements with a certain pride. "I'm glad they're being appreciated." His simplicity and sincerity cut through the heavy air of Veronica's insinuations like a fresh breeze. It was almost impossible to irritate him, and this began to create a veiled tension between them. Veronica, who always excelled at controlling conversations and manipulating emotions, found herself up against an impenetrable wall, Ethan's silent dignity. Veronica let out a light laugh as if to mask a growing irritation. "You really have a unique way of seeing things, Ethan. I think this environment is so unusual for you that you're doing better than I expected." Her words were like arrows fired with a disguised smile, but Ethan remained unscathed, immune to the hidden venom. "I'm just enjoying the night," he responded, as if commenting on something as simple as the weather. The hall seemed to breathe with the growing tension between the two. The guests, now paying attention to the interaction, began to realize that something was unfolding there, something they couldn't name but felt in the air. Veronica, always the woman in control, seemed to be gradually losing the advantage she thought she had over Ethan. And with every new attempt to unsettle him, what she found was a man whose inner peace was as solid as it was unbreakable. Ethan continued to move around the hall, calm, unhurried, as if he were in his own garden that he loved so much. His silence seemed to bother more than any sharp response could. With every subtle jab from Veronica, he responded with a simple smile or a gentle look, as if he had already understood something that no one there seemed to know. His lack of reaction protected him like an invisible wall. Veronica's arrogant shine began to falter, as she expected something more, perhaps a misstep, a wrong word, a moment of embarrassment that never came. The guests around, who had been watching with malicious smiles, began to feel a change in the atmosphere. There was something strange about that man who did not react as expected. The glances, once full of superiority, now became curious, intrigued. How could he remain so serene amidst that sea of ostentation and provocations? Ethan's silence, far from being a sign of submission, conveyed a quiet strength, something rare and incomprehensible to many there. Veronica, who always dominated situations, felt control slipping from her hands. She tried to regain power over the evening. She continued to draw Ethan into conversations, to put him in embarrassing situations, but he remained unfazed, almost as if nothing happening around him could touch him. Veronica smiled, disguised her irritation, but inside it grew. The tension between the two was palpable, and the other guests could feel it too. There was something more that night, something that was beginning to reveal itself in the subtext of glances and the silent pauses between conversations. At some point, Veronica, already exasperated by the lack of reaction, approached Ethan with another of her insinuations. "You know, Ethan, many here had to fight to get where they are. It's curious to see how some like you are so calm. Perhaps because they have no idea what's really happening, isn't that right?" She smiled, like a snake about to strike, waiting to finally see him falter. But Ethan simply looked at her for a moment, his gaze serene and deep, before replying gently, "Sometimes calm comes from understanding what truly matters." Those words, so simple and sincere, cut through the air like a whisper that echoed louder than any aggressive response could have. Veronica blinked, surprised, not knowing how to react. This was not in the script. She expected submission, embarrassment, but found dignity. The party continued around them, but at that moment, it felt as if the entire hall had fallen silent, as if something deeper was at play. Veronica realized too late that her attempt to humiliate Ethan was, in fact, backfiring on her. The tension now didn't come from Ethan, but from Veronica, who began to realize that he was untouchable. His silence, his simple responses, all seemed like a barrier she couldn't break through. And what was most intriguing, the other guests were noticing it too. The glances that had once been full of superiority now wavered between confusion and respect. It was as if, little by little, everyone realized that the true power in that room didn't come from the sparkling jewels or sharp words, but from the calm presence of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. While Veronica tried to hide her discomfort behind calculated smiles, Ethan continued his walk through the hall. He spoke to other guests without hurry, without fear. Every word of his was devoid of pretense, but carried a simple wisdom that few there could understand. And yet, his silence said more than any elaborate speech could. He didn't need to defend himself, didn't need to raise his voice. The tranquility of his soul made any provocation lose its effect. The mansion, once filled with controlled laughter and superficial conversations, now seemed like the stage for something much larger. Ethan's presence, his peaceful resistance, transformed the environment in a way that Veronica hadn't foreseen. The power game she had orchestrated was slipping from her control. It was as if the party, which had been planned to exalt her status, was turning against her, exposing the fragility behind her facade of perfection. And as the night went on, the tension grew. Everyone seemed to feel that something was about to happen. Ethan, always silent, continued to move through the hall like a serene presence amid the chaos. Veronica, on the other hand, increasingly uncomfortable, felt the weight of her own trap. She had summoned an audience, but now it was she who was being judged. The unexpected outcome was beginning to take shape on the horizon, just waiting for the right moment to unfold. The hall was at the peak of its splendor. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, and the conversations were an orchestra of vanities. In the center, Veronica, still sporting a controlled smile, observed everything closely. Then the much-anticipated moment arrived, the announcement of the donations. A microphone was positioned on the main stage, and the hosts began calling the names of the guests, encouraging them to make their contributions publicly, each donation bigger than the last. It was the moment when material wealth should shine more than ever, and Veronica was ready to savor every bid, every check signed as if it were an extension of her own power. Between the invitations for donations, the murmurs in the hall intensified. It was a spectacle. Each announced amount brought a mix of applause and discreet glances, each one measuring the generosity of the other by the amount offered. Veronica, with her sharp eye, already predicted the contributions of some of her wealthiest guests. But, unexpectedly, a new movement caught attention. Slowly, Ethan rose from his seat at the back of the hall. The humble gardener, who had remained silent until that moment, now calmly headed to the stage. At first, there was a murmur of surprise. Some guests exchanged incredulous glances. What was he doing? What could he, someone so simple, possibly have to say in an environment where money spoke the loudest? Veronica, paralyzed, watched with a mix of perplexity and discomfort. It wasn't in her plans for Ethan to stand out. She had expected him to stay on the sidelines, observing, feeling out of place. But now, there he was, about to say something in front of everyone. When Ethan took the microphone, the hall fell silent. He seemed calm, as serene as he had been throughout the night. "I would like to say a few words about charity," he began, his soft but firm voice echoing through the hall. His eyes wandered over the crowd, without fear or hesitation. "For me, charity has never been about how much you can give. It isn't measured in figures, and it isn't something to show off. Charity, to me, has always been about intention. About what we're willing to give up, not to be seen, but to truly help from the heart." Those words, so simple yet so profound, began to reverberate through the hall. The audience, previously relaxed and lively, now listened with almost religious attention. Ethan continued, "Often, the truest act of charity is the one no one sees. It's that moment when you give not because you have too much, but because you feel you can make a difference in someone's life." His eyes roamed over the tables, briefly capturing the confused glances of some guests, and then they rested for a second on Veronica, who now watched him with a racing heart. Veronica tried to hide her discomfort behind a tense smile, but she felt the control of the night slipping through her fingers. Ethan continued, his voice free of any pretense but filled with authenticity. "I've learned a lot working in gardens. Plants don't grow by the amount of water they receive at once, but by constant care, by time, by the quiet love someone dedicates to them. Charity is the same way. It isn't measured by how much you can give at an event like this, but by how much you're willing to sacrifice for someone without anyone knowing." The silence in the hall was almost deafening now. Everyone seemed to absorb those words, reflecting, perhaps, on their own acts of charity. Ethan spoke of something many there had forgotten: the true purpose behind a donation. It wasn't about status or being seen as generous. It was about genuine compassion, something that couldn't be measured in money. Each of Ethan's words dropped like a stone in the calm pond of the event. The ripples from his speech spread, reaching every corner of the hall. Veronica, sitting at the back with her hands clasped around her champagne glass, felt more exposed with every passing second. The party, once a reflection of her power and control, was slowly being overtaken by a message she never expected to hear that night. The contrast between Veronica's intentions and the truth that Ethan was revealing was now clear to everyone. Ethan then paused, as if his next words were the most important. "True charity is not about the amounts you can display but the sacrifice you make in silence." He didn't need to say more. The impact of his words had already deeply affected everyone there. The audience, still unsure how to react, remained in silence, feeling the weight of something that had seemed to be forgotten in the grandeur of the evening. The hall, which minutes earlier had been filled with controlled laughter and vain murmurs, now lingered in an uncomfortable silence, as if everyone there had been confronted with something far greater than they had expected. Ethan, still standing on the stage, looked at the audience for a moment. There was a calmness in his gaze, as if he already knew the impact of his words even before speaking them. He took a deep breath and, with the same simplicity with which he always conducted his life, continued, "And today, I would like to make my donation." The glances, initially filled with indifference, were now fixed on him, attentive to every word. Some still believed that this was some kind of distraction, perhaps a symbolic gesture. After all, what could a gardener offer in the midst of the hefty sums contributed by businessmen and millionaires? Veronica, from the back of the hall, crossed her arms, her expression frozen in an uncertain smile. She didn't know what to expect, but something in her chest tightened, a feeling that the control she always exercised was slipping from her hands. "I don't have much," Ethan began, his serene voice breaking the absolute silence. "But over the years I saved what I could. Not for myself, but because I believe that, sometimes, small actions can make a big difference." The tension in the room grew. Each word he spoke seemed to slowly and carefully disarm the atmosphere of ostentation that Veronica had built. The brilliance of the chandeliers, the clinking of the crystal glasses, and the hushed murmurs of the guests now seemed distant, insignificant. And then the blow came. "Today I would like to donate the sum of $50,000. The statement dropped like a bomb in the hall, reverberating like thunder in the silence. There was an evident shock on everyone's faces. Veronica, who until then had maintained an expression of controlled superiority, let her jaw drop for a brief moment, unable to hide her astonishment. The gardener, that humble man, was donating an amount that many there would consider significant, even by their standards. The impact was immediate. The mouths that had been murmuring disdain were now shut, in a silence that only reinforced the incredulity in the air. This was not what anyone expected. A man who clearly didn't live surrounded by luxury was offering more than many of the guests themselves would feel comfortable donating. And there was no display of grandeur in his gesture, only the simplicity of someone who believed in the cause. Ethan, unperturbed, stepped down from the stage without looking to the sides, walking with the same tranquility that always accompanied him. The eyes followed him, but he seemed oblivious to the uproar he had caused. For him, there was nothing extraordinary in what he had just done. It was merely the manifestation of a deep belief that true generosity doesn't come from excess but from sincere sacrifice. Veronica, sitting in her chair, struggled to regain her composure. The shock still dominated her thoughts. This had completely escaped her control. She could never have imagined that the man she intended to humiliate with her grand party would turn the tables in such a way. Worse, she had no answer. How could she now confront someone who, with such naturalness, had exposed the hypocrisy of the environment around them? The room remained in a state of suspension, as if no one knew how to return to the normal course of the evening. Ethan's gesture echoed in the minds of the attendees like a truth that could no longer be ignored. And there, at the center of it all, Veronica, the queen of that party, found herself speechless, surrounded by the quiet greatness of a man who, with a single action, had rewritten the narrative of the night. As the minutes passed, the hall no longer felt the same. Something had changed forever. And at the heart of that change was the unexpected gesture of a gardener who, with his humility, had more to offer than anyone could have imagined. The impact of Ethan's words and donation reverberated through the hall like a wave, hitting each guest in a different way. The silence that seemed to echo right after the announcement was slowly filled with a new atmosphere, one of admiration and, for many, of shame. Some whispered among themselves, still processing what they had just witnessed. Others remained motionless, staring at the floor or at their champagne glasses, as if they had been confronted with an inconvenient truth. The amount itself, significant for anyone, wasn't the only reason for the reaction. The true shock was in the altruistic and unexpected gesture of Ethan, a man most had barely noticed until that moment. Those who, moments earlier, viewed Ethan as a social curiosity, someone out of place, now looked at him with respect. There was something undeniably powerful in what he had done. While many there donated immense sums without really thinking about the meaning, Ethan had given a significant portion of what he had saved over the years, with a genuine heart. For some, this brought a bitter reflection on what it truly means to be generous. The more vain among the guests tried to disguise their discomfort, forcing smiles or rolling their eyes in silence, as if Ethan's donation were an indirect blow to their own morality. But even among them, something had changed. That night, which was supposed to be a display of status and power, was now taking a turn that no one expected. What had once been a veiled competition of ostentation had now turned into a silent introspection about the true value of a gesture. Veronica, still seated in her throne of power, felt the atmosphere of the party slipping from her control. She, who always commanded the spotlight with precision, now seemed overshadowed by the humility of a man who, in just a few minutes, had changed the course of her grand night. While the silence lingered, she struggled to maintain her poised posture, but something in her eyes betrayed her discomfort. The confident smile she had displayed moments earlier no longer held the same firmness. On the other side of the room, Ethan, as if nothing had happened, had returned to his seat. He wasn't seeking applause nor recognition. For him, this wasn't a moment of glory, but a sincere expression of his worldview. His gesture, far from being a declaration of moral superiority, was merely an extension of what he believed. And perhaps it was this simplicity, this absence of desire for validation, that unsettled the others the most. As the guests continued to process the emotional impact of the scene, some began to approach Ethan. At first, hesitantly, as if unsure how to approach him. A businessman with his impeccable suit murmured a reserved compliment, clearly uncomfortable. "That was admirable what you did." Others slowly followed his lead, some shaking his hand, others simply offering a respectful nod. The party had transformed from a parade of egos into something much more human. Among the glances circulating through the hall, there was a mix of reflection and admiration. Guests who hours before were competing for attention and status, now seemed small in the face of the magnitude of Ethan's gesture. Some clearly felt their faces flush with shame. Their own donations, made with ulterior motives, now sounded hollow in comparison. Many, for the first time, realized that humility and generosity were virtues that could neither be bought nor staged. Veronica watched everything, unable to act. Her mind raced, trying to find a way to salvage the night, to regain control of the narrative. But no matter how hard she tried, the weight of the situation began to crush her. What had once been her party, her stage, now seemed to belong to Ethan, and worse, to the glances of the guests who, one by one, began to turn away from her direction. She felt control slipping away, the tension rooted in the subtext of every conversation. The hall, so grand in its decoration and excess, now seemed too small to contain the whirlwind of emotions that began to form. The guests, who had previously been focused on external appearances, were now forced to look within, and for many, the reflection they saw was not as glamorous as their clothes and jewels had suggested. The greatness of that night was no longer in the lights, the chandeliers, or the expensive dresses. It was in a simple man who, with a humble gesture, had rewritten the narrative of everyone there. The silence in the hall was becoming almost unbearable, as if the air had grown too thick to breathe. All the eyes, which had wandered curiously or admiringly over Ethan, now slowly turned towards Veronica. She felt the weight of every glance, the silent judgment that grew with every passing second. Her skin, usually cool and flawless, began to flush slowly and treacherously. The redness rose from her neck to her face, burning with shame and embarrassment, something she couldn't control. Veronica's hands, always steady and delicate, now trembled slightly, prompting her to clasp them together in her lap, trying to contain her nervousness. The champagne glass, still in her hands, visibly wobbled, threatening to spill the drink at any moment. She, who had always been in absolute control of everything around her, now felt small, vulnerable. Every detail of her perfect appearance seemed like a mask that was about to fall. The audience waited for something. A gesture, a word, any sign that Veronica could regain control of the night that had slipped from her grasp. But she was lost in thought, fighting an internal battle between her wounded pride and the reality unfolding before her eyes. She had never experienced this kind of exposure. At that moment, more than ever, the massive and opulent mansion seemed to shrink around her, as if the walls were closing in, compressing her arrogance with a silent force. Veronica tried to smile, but it was a weak smile without conviction that quickly disappeared. The guests now looked at her differently, as if expecting a reaction she didn't know how to offer. The control she had so carefully maintained over her image, her words, the entire party, was unraveling before everyone. She could feel the weight of failure, but didn't know how to respond without making her situation even worse. Her eyes wandered around the hall in search of some refuge, some distraction that could shift the focus away from her. But all she found were more and more glances, each laden with a mix of surprise, disappointment, and, perhaps, pity. And that pierced her in a way she never expected. Pity. That was worse than any disdain. To be seen as someone worthy of compassion gnawed at her insides. The sound of clinking glasses, once so elegant and musical, now seemed harsh and cruel against her ears. The controlled laughter and subtle conversations had disappeared, replaced by an unbearable silence. Even the music, which had once filled the air with sophistication, now seemed only a distant backdrop, incapable of easing the growing discomfort. The scene that Veronica had built to shine was now becoming the stage for her humiliation. She quickly glanced at Ethan, who was still sitting in his chair, as serene as ever. He wasn't looking at her, nor was he seeking approval or recognition. His calm presence only reinforced the brutal contrast between his simplicity and the chaos simmering within Veronica. He had won the admiration of everyone with an unpretentious gesture, while she, with all her resources and manipulations, was now crumbling before her own eyes. The conversation slowly resumed, but not in the way Veronica had planned. They weren't filled with animated laughter or praise for the splendor of the party, but rather whispers, shared glances that spoke more than any words uttered aloud. She knew she was at the center of those conversations, but now not as the untouchable, powerful hostess, but as someone who had lost control and exposed a vulnerability that should never have been seen. Veronica could feel the entire room watching her next move. What would she do now? How would she respond to a blow she had never anticipated? The blush still burned on her face, her hands still trembled. For the first time in a long while, Veronica Hastings didn't know what to do. Veronica felt the unbearable weight of every glance, every whisper, as if the entire hall were conspiring against her. The heat rose up her neck, and the blush was now something she could no longer hide. The hands that once held the champagne glass so firmly now trembled, and the cold glass in her fingers seemed a cruel reminder of her failed attempt to humiliate Ethan. Everything she had planned had disintegrated before her eyes, and the only thing left was the urgent need to escape. She stood up slowly, trying not to draw attention, but in that environment of silence and tension, every movement of hers seemed amplified. Veronica, always used to being the center of attention, now wished to be invisible, a desire she had never felt before. The opulence around her, the sparkling chandeliers, the perfectly arranged flower displays, the soft background music, all the symbols she used to signify her power now seemed to suffocate her. It was as if the mansion itself was witnessing her defeat. The guests noticed her departure, but no one stopped her. The glances that had once turned toward her with admiration now carried something very different, the curiosity of those watching an empire crumble. She walked quickly, though trying to maintain control, in a desperate attempt to preserve some semblance of dignity. However, panic was etched in her eyes, and she knew that each second she stayed in that hall only deepened her humiliation. As she passed through the grand doors, Veronica finally managed to breathe. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but it also brought a brief relief. She looked up at the starry sky, but even the heavens, once so distant and untouchable, seemed to mock her fall. She, who had once ruled over that party, was now nothing more than a fleeting figure, running from the consequences of her own arrogance. Veronica walked through the gardens that Ethan had so carefully tended. Every flower, every leaf seemed to remind her of her monumental failure. The contrast between her life of excess and Ethan's simplicity now weighed heavier than she could bear. He, who was supposed to be the victim of her grand night, had become the symbol of everything she could never be: humble, integral, unshaken. She kept walking, her heels sinking into the soft grass, until she reached the farthest point of the property, away from the lights and the gazes. It was there, in the darkness, that she felt the full magnitude of her defeat. Her plan, which seemed so well calculated, had crumbled, revealing not only Ethan's strength but the fragility of her own character. For the first time, Veronica felt the emptiness that had always been there but had been masked by parties, wealth, and power. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. Charity is not about how much you give, but how much you sacrifice. She had never understood that before. To her, money was power, and power was the only real value. But now, surrounded by her own solitude, Veronica realized that she had lost something she had never truly possessed: authenticity, connection, humility. And for the first time she felt lost, not knowing where to go. Veronica stopped walking, the cold wind lightly rustling her silk dress, now a hollow symbol of a night that should have been triumphant. Tears, which she could no longer hold back, began to fall silently down her face. The impenetrable woman, who had never allowed weakness to show, now stood alone with her failures. And the weight of her own arrogance, something she had never recognized before, finally crushed her. Without looking back, Veronica knew that something inside her had broken. And at the same time, perhaps something new had been born. But at that moment, all she could do was flee, to distance herself from the world that no longer venerated her. She walked toward the darkness, unsure if she would find her way back. Dawn arrived quietly and serenely, enveloping the garden in a soft light that seemed almost magical. Ethan, as he did every day, woke up early before the sun touched the horizon. He walked among the flowers he tended with such care, his steps calm as if the previous night had not been marked by a grand event. The earth beneath his hands and the fresh morning air connected him to a peace that few could comprehend. For him, nothing had changed. He was still just Ethan, the gardener, doing his work with love and humility. As he pruned the rose bushes, he heard the distant sound of a car arriving on the property. He paid little attention. Over the years, he had learned to ignore the comings and goings of visitors and meetings that Veronica's mansion always attracted. However, the unexpected arrival of a man in an elegant suit, followed by a woman equally well-dressed, caught his attention. They approached Ethan, their smiles carefully polished, as if ready to deliver some grand speech. "Mr. Ethan," the man began, extending his hand, "we heard about what happened last night. Your generosity impressed everyone. My wife and I are starting a new company and would like to invite you to work with us. Your integrity would be a great example for our employees." The woman beside him nodded enthusiastically, as if the offer were irresistible. "Without a doubt, you are exactly the kind of person we need. It would be an honor to have you on our team." Ethan, always serene, listened attentively. He thanked them with a gentle smile, but in his heart, he already knew the answer. "I'm very grateful for the offer," he said calmly, while cutting another branch of the rose bush. "But I found my peace here in what I do. Working with the earth, seeing the plants grow, it's all I need." The couple, somewhat surprised by the simplicity of his response, hesitated for a moment. They weren't used to someone turning down opportunities based on status or wealth. But Ethan didn't seek recognition. For him, the most valuable work was the one that brought meaning, not success in the eyes of others. The couple said their goodbyes, clearly disconcerted, but Ethan simply returned to his work. Several other offers would come in the following days: invitations to speak at charity events, jobs at large corporations, all praising his humble attitude. But he would decline them all with the same tranquility. He didn't need more than he already had. The value of his life wasn't in social ascension, but in remaining true to who he was. And that was something that money and recognition couldn't buy. Meanwhile, Veronica remained reclusive in her mansion. The glow of her party had already faded, and what remained was an uncomfortable silence. For the first time, she found herself facing a reflection she didn't know how to handle. The image she had always projected, the imposing, powerful woman, above all criticism, now seemed fragile. She began to view her home with new eyes. The cold marble, the luxurious chandeliers, the jewels scattered on her vanity, all seemed empty, devoid of the meaning she once believed they possessed. Veronica questioned herself, something she had never done before. What really made her happy? Why, with all the power and wealth she had, did she feel increasingly distant from true satisfaction? Ethan, with his simplicity, had torn down the entire structure she had built over her life. He didn't seek to impress, didn't care what others thought, and yet he seemed more complete than she had ever been. For the first time, Veronica was forced to confront the emptiness that filled her inside. Days passed, and she continued to avoid the large halls, preferring the solitude of her room. She looked at herself in the mirror but no longer recognized the person staring back. The masks of control and superiority that she had always worn now seemed too heavy to bear. There was something in her soul that she had never explored, a corner of her mind that she avoided. And now, alone, confronted by her own fragility, she had nowhere to run. It was time to rethink everything. While Veronica delved into her introspection, Ethan continued his simple life, never imagining the profound impact he had caused. The garden flourished under his care, and like the plants that grew quietly, he continued on his path, needing nothing more than what he had always had. The truth for him was clear. True wealth was in the small things, in being honest with oneself, and in the peace of living a life of integrity. And that was something no one could ever take away. Veronica spent days immersed in an introspection she had never experienced before. The nights were long and silent, filled only with a loneliness that had become her sole companion. She began to question the essence of her life and, most of all, why she had always needed to humiliate others to feel superior. The emptiness she felt now seemed like a bottomless pit, and for the first time in years, Veronica felt an urgency for change, to find something real. She knew she couldn't continue the way she had been. Something inside her needed to break so that she could rebuild herself. One afternoon, looking out the window of the mansion, she saw Ethan tending the garden as he always did. His serenity, his simple and sincere dedication to the earth, was a constant reminder of the night when everything fell apart. But instead of feeling contempt or resentment, Veronica felt something different: admiration. He, the man she had tried to humiliate, had taught her the greatest lesson of her life. It was in that moment that she made a decision she never thought she would make. She went down the stairs and walked toward the garden. Ethan saw her approaching but said nothing. He continued his work, knowing that when she was ready she would speak. Veronica stopped beside him, looking at the flowers with a gaze she had never had before. For long minutes, silence reigned between them, until finally she took a deep breath and said with a trembling voice, "Ethan, I owe you an apology. What I did that night was shameful." She looked away embarrassed. "I thought power came from money, from control. But you showed me I was wrong." Ethan, without stopping his pruning, replied calmly, "True strength comes from within, Veronica. We all have the ability to change if we desire it." The simplicity of his words struck her deeply. For the first time in a long time, Veronica felt she was on the right path. She looked at the garden, a symbol of calm and growth, and knew what she needed to do. It wasn't just about apologizing, it was about transforming, about rebuilding her life based on something she had never known: humility. The next day, Veronica took the boldest step of her life. She sold most of her jewelry, donated a significant portion of her fortune to charitable causes, and began investing her time in helping underprivileged communities, something she had never considered before. She started spending time in her own garden, not as the powerful mistress, but as someone learning, side by side with Ethan, the value of taking care of things with her own hands. Slowly, Veronica found a new peace, a new way of living. She was no longer the queen of the party but a woman searching for meaning. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Veronica and Ethan, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel to keep bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential for us to continue improving. Thank you for your help. Until the next exciting chronicle.